Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And as you can see, today's topic is manifest destiny in war. Now, we're going to do a kind of a time jump here and pick up at the end of the Spanish rule. But before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, and be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. So, kind of the first major content lecture here was all about pre-contact Americas. And it's focusing specifically, of course, on Mesoamerica, Mexico, Southwest United States region, what became ultimately New Spain. And we ended with what New Spain looked like in the 1530s, the 1540s, the 1550s. And we saw a very stratified, rigid caste system that will endure through into the 19th century. And so you're talking here almost 300 years. Now, this is all very important information in there. There's a lot of things going on in New Spain that's fascinating, that's important to understand. And hopefully you've taken a good world history course. In your future, take a good history of Mexico course. And hopefully if you've taken Mexican American History Part 1, you will have a better understanding of that. But we are going to do a time jump here. And we're going to jump to 1810. Now again, this is almost 300 years from the start of Spanish rule, which of course started with Cortés defeating Montezuma in 1521. Now, on September 16th, 1810, Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costillas famously issued, supposedly, the famous El Grito, the shout, the calling of independence. And what it is said that he spoke that night was, "My children, a new dispensation comes to us today. Will you free yourselves? Will you recover the land stolen 300 years ago from your forefathers by the hated Spaniards? We must act at once." Unquote. Now, officially, of course, if you know anything about Mexican history, and if you are living, especially in the Southwest United States, you probably understand that the 16 de septiembre, December 16th, is considered Mexican Independence Day. Of course, what happened on that day was, again, there are some modern historians and modern research that has said maybe, probably, the El Grito never actually was said by Father Hidalgo, at least not in the way it's kind of been mythologized. But nonetheless, as far as Mexican independence goes, it kind of starts right here, September 16th, 1810. And this officially begins the independence movement of Mexico, of Mexicans, from Spain. But here's the thing. Unlike the U.S., which will take 7 years for the U.S. Revolutionary War against Great Britain, the Mexican independence is going to take 11 years. And one of the reasons for that was that the original movement, again, started by Father Hidalgo, it kind of began among the mestizos, which, according to the caste system, they were lower class, right? And compared to the elites, compared to the Spaniards, the Peninsulares, according to the Criollos, these mestizos were often viewed as rabble, as complainers. And as a result of that, there was never this huge unity moment when it came to the independence movement, at least in the early years. However, once the middle/upper class, the criollos, once they get involved in the movement, then it becomes, quote unquote, more respectable. And though it will take 11 years, eventually they will kind of, in a way, it's kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Even though the Criollos and the Mestizos did not get along, even though this is going to set up hostility going forward that will plague Mexican history, because both sides are vying for power and control. Ultimately, they will come together long enough, it took 11 years, to oust the Spanish. And so finally in 1821, Mexico, after more than a decade of warfare, will finally win their independence from Spain. The big difference here, though, is because even though the two major groups, the Criollos and the Mestizos, will ultimately work together to oust the Spaniards, when you compare it to something like U.S. history in the American Revolution, the American Revolution, if you remember U.S. history, you talk about people like Thomas Paine, who said, united we stand, divided we fall, right? That we have to come together to defeat the British. And by and large, the Americans were able to do that. However, immediately following independence, Mexico will be embroiled in a constant state of civil warfare. And again, I'm not saying this was a direct civil war, but there's going to be constant uprisings that the Mexican government has to deal with. Because both these groups, the Criollos and the Mestizos, are going to vie for power. When it came to freedom, they worked together, they got that. But now is a struggle for power. And the Criollos, remember, those are the ones who were born in New Spain, but they were of Spanish ancestry to Spaniard parents. Now, they had grown dramatically in the last 300 years since the 1630s. But while they had equal wealth with those in power, the Peninsulares, they had none of the associating power. But then there's the Mestizos, who had some limited wealth. They owned some land, but they still lacked any power. Oh, then of course, don't forget, there are the Indios, there are the enslaved Africans. There are other groups who will also toil in the fields. They will fight. They will die in this war of independence. And afterward, they get little. So almost immediately in 1821, there's immediate hostility between the Mestizos and the Criollos. So much so that the initial leader of Mexico, independent Mexico, was Augustin de Iturbide. And Iturbide, he is going to be almost hated immediately by the Mexican people. And within 2 years, in 1823, General Santa Anna is going to help dispose of the proclaimed Emperor of Mexico, Iturbide. And he's going to help establish Mexico as an independent republic with its own president. Now, again, there's a whole lot more to discuss here that we're going to kind of skip over, because you should have studied this in Mexican American Studies Part 1, or it's just not the time and place for it right now. But nonetheless, so in 1821, short version, Mexico gets independence. 1823, Santa Anna leads a revolt to oust Iturbide and to install a president in the Republic of Mexico. One of the other interesting things, though, is even though it starts in 1821 with independence, Mexico begins the gradual abolition of slavery. And finally, in 1829, the president of Mexico will officially end slavery in Mexico by decree. Think about this for a minute. This is 1829 officially. This is going to be more than 30 years before the United States was going to end slavery. Also in 1829, Santa Anna is going to once again return as a general and help prevent Spain from recapturing Mexico. Because Spain is looking on and saying, we didn't want to lose this war. We didn't want to lose our very rich colony. And they will try to reclaim Mexico in 1829. And with the great help of Santa Anna, they are going to be able to repel the Spanish once again. And this popularity is going to lead him to become president himself in 1833. Now, again, there are a lot of problems that Santa Anna is dealing with. There's a lot going on. Again, this is a new country. It's unstable. They're trying their own great experiment that may or may not work. And again, there's a lot of problems we could discuss. But again, I'm trying to get this be very focused here on how this ties to ultimately U.S. history and specifically Mexican-American studies. And so one of Santa Anna's very big problems was dealing with what was then the northern frontier, which of course is now Southwest United States. It's specifically what is modern day Texas. Because Texas is a very sparsely populated area in terms of Mexicans. It's underdeveloped. So even though everyone knows Texas seemingly has great agricultural potential, due to the sparse population, due to constant fears of Indian attacks, Texas area is very underdeveloped. And so Santa Anna needs money to help develop it. He needs help defending his Mexican people from Indian attacks. And he also has this goal, if you can develop and build up this northern frontier, you can help prevent, hopefully, the United States from invading Mexico. Now, obviously, we know from history, this is ultimately going to be his undoing. But initially, this sounds like a good plan. And if you look through world history, bringing in outsiders to help develop your frontier can be a good strategy. So in this case, the Mexican government began to work with a group of people known as empresarios. And these empresarios, they operated as land agents in modern-day Texas. These empresarios would work to bring settlers in who would help develop Texas for the Mexican government. And in exchange, these settlers will receive large grants of land. Now, of course, one of the most famous empresarios is a man by the name of Stephen F. Austin. And Stephen F. Austin will act as an empresario. He will bring more than 300 families from the United States to settle in Texas. And when I say they were given land grants, I don't mean they're given a 1-acre plot. No. This is Texas. Everything's bigger in Texas. These were 4,600 acres for each family. So each of these 300 families is going to get 4,600 acres. And as an empresario, Stephen F. Austin himself will be compensated with an even larger plot of land. In other words, the more people you recruited, the more land you got. Now, the vast majority of people who came to Austin's settlement were themselves Southern cotton farmers from the United States. In other words, they're bringing with them their idea that they're going to cultivate and harvest cotton in Texas. Of course, they also bring with them a very rigid racial hierarchy. And they also bring with them, of course, enslaved African Americans who they plan to have used to work the cotton fields. Now, you may remember, I told you just a few minutes ago that as of 1829, Mexico has banned slavery. And yet here are these Americans coming in the mid-1830s. Again, this is 4 or 5 years after Mexico has banned slavery, and they're bringing with them, well, human property. Now, officially, originally, Santa Anna and the Mexican government would grant a temporary exemption to that ban just for Texas. Now, on the one hand, this is incredibly effective because by the mid-1830s, thousands of U.S. citizens have come into Texas. They are beginning to develop the land. The result of this, though, is that by the mid-1830s, by 1835, Americans, U.S. citizens, significantly outnumbered Mexicans in Texas. In fact, statistically, there were about 15,000 Anglo-Americans, plus 1,000 enslaved African Americans. So here you have 15,000 Anglos, 1,000 enslaved that they brought with them. And again, this is in defiance of Mexican rule, of Mexican laws, compared to just 5,000 Tejanos, those Mexicans living in the region of Texas. But here's the thing, and again, you have to visualize this and reconceptualize our understanding of this. These U.S. citizens were invited by a foreign country to go live in that foreign country to abide by their rules, and were basically given temporary or at least dual citizenship. They are allowed to live, reside, work, buy land in a foreign country. These are citizens now of Mexico. But despite all these things given to them, all these Anglo-Americans, these 15,000, they've largely retained their affinity for U.S. culture and customs. And Santa Anna begins to worry that they're getting too numerous, that they are basically ignoring Mexican rule, Mexican laws, that they're going to start a revolt. And so in 1835, 1836, the Mexican government under Santa Anna tries to force the end of slavery in the northern region. They begin to impose taxes on the Anglo settlers and to end immigration from the United States. Again, these are all reasonable things because, once again, these were invited guests living now in a foreign country. But rather than abide by their rules, these Anglo-Americans led by Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston, they are going to spurn Mexican rules, spurn Mexican laws, ignore what the Mexican government is requiring of them. And of course, tension is going to boil over. And the thing is, don't forget, as this is going on, yes, mestizos are now in charge of the Mexican government. Santa Anna is a mestizo. He is leading a mestizo government, I should say. But the Indios, those poorer classes of Mexicans, are also engaged in a fight for independence themselves. They want land. And again, if you know anything about Mexican history, you have to understand that the government and the Catholic Church own the vast majority of land in Mexico. And so by 1836, Santa Anna is faced with two major problems. Number one is, well, they're both internal, but number one is the internal struggle of the mestizos, his government, against his own people, the Indios, who they want recognition, they want power, they want land, they want some autonomy. And he's dealing with a huge issue on his northern border, i.e. Texas, because these Anglo-Americans that he invited in are not listening to the rules of Mexico. And again, I'm not going to go into any tremendous detail here regarding the Texas War of Independence, because most of you all know it from high school. Most of you have had 2 years of Texas history. You've had U.S. history. You probably had Mexican-American studies for this part. So the short, simple, of course, you have the whole, come and take it. You have the whole, remember the Alamo. And of course, very famously, you have the April 21st, 1836, the Battle of San Jacinto, where Santa Anna was caught off guard. He's a brilliant general. He had a bad day. He got caught off guard, and he was surprised by the rebels in this case, these invited guests who have rebelled, the Anglo-Texans. And so in 1836, April 21st, Santa Anna will surrender, and basically to spare his life, remember, he's still president, to spare his life, he is going to say, okay, fine, whatever, you can have your independence. Fun fact, little aside, Texas is the only state in the country, of the United States, to fight 2 wars just so they could claim the right to enslave other human beings. Just a fun fact. Now, please understand now, upon independence in 1836, all these, well, in this case, Texans now, these Anglos, so Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin, etc., despite the fact they gained their independence in 1836, what they want is to become annexed by the United States. They still want to be U.S. citizens. They want to be American. They want to immediately be annexed by the United States and become a new state. However, this new Republic of Texas, this independent Republic of Texas, is financially unstable. Remember, they weren't even a country before this. They were just a small region on the frontier of Mexico that was just recently developed in the last 3 years. So they have no government. They don't have a long-term viability of financial stability. So they are financially weak. They have no government yet. Again, it's brand new. In addition, despite Santa Anna signing over Texas, the Mexican government, post Santa Anna as president, does not recognize Texas independence. They still claim Texas as part of their territory. It's in rebellion, but they still don't fully recognize Texas independence. And therefore, when Texas seeks admission to the United States, it's rejected by President Andrew Jackson. Because Andrew Jackson is reluctant to act on the issue of Texas because it is a weak republic. He does not want to provoke war with Mexico. Andrew Jackson is a small government president. He believes the government should be small. And do you really want to risk, number one, having to kind of shore up the financial situation of this new region that's financially unstable? And then second, do you want to risk a war with Mexico? Because Mexico makes it very clear they don't recognize Texas independence. And to annex Texas may be to provoke a war with Mexico. In addition, in 1836, the United States had 26 states. 13 were known as slave states, 13 were free states, which means they had Senate balance, because in the Senate, each state gets 2 representatives. If you allow Texas in and it becomes a slave state, now the southern states have more power in the Senate. And that's something that many in the United States did not want to have happen. Texas, however, would once again join the headlines in 1844. So 1836, it gets its independence. And kind of for 8 years, they're their own thing. And as a result, we forever have to be reminded that they were the one state that was once a country, and they must have their own national anthem played, and everyone knows the Texas flag as a reason. But Texas becomes headlines again in 1844. So in 1844, it's a presidential election year. And the incumbent president was John Tyler. Now, the problem with John Tyler is he ran in 1840 as a Whig. Once he became president, it was quickly discovered he wasn't really a Whig. He didn't like big government things that Whigs liked, like banks, like tariffs. And as a result, they felt like, dude, why do you not like these things we like? And John Tyler's response is, well, I'm not really a Whig. I'm actually just a Democrat who hates Andrew Jackson. And so in the election of 1844, John Tyler is hoping to get elected on his own merits. He wants to, stay president, which most do. And so in 1844, John Tyler needs an issue to run on. He needs a big issue that will bring the nation, rally the nation behind him. And he chooses the issue of Texas. And he chooses to say, we need to annex Texas as this huge issue. Now, ultimately, he's going to be rejected. He's going to lose. In fact, he will barely be on the ballot. Because the 2 major political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, as you see in your screen, the Whigs choose Henry Clay, the Democrats choose James K. Polk. And both of these candidates are going to say, yeah, we agree. Texas should be annexed. And by the way, they also went so far, not only Texas, they also wanted Oregon, which is kind of disputed territory with Great Britain. And both of these candidates, James K. Polk, Henry Clay, both saw this and ran on this issue as a matter of manifest destiny. Now, I'm sure you all know what manifest destiny is. You've all seen the photo in the bottom left corner of your screen right now. Again, a very famous photo depicting the light coming to the darkness, depicting the Americans, Anglo-Americans, bringing their proper, sophisticated, superior civilization to the darkness of the West. Now, manifest destiny is a term that's coined by John O'Sullivan, who in 1845 is going to declare and write out explicitly what manifest destiny means. You see on your screen here. You see here, it says, Texas is now ours. Her star and her stripe may already be said to have taken their place in the glorious blazon of our common nationality. In the sweep of our eagle's wings already includes within its circuit the wide extent of her fair and fertile land. She, Texas, is no longer a mere geographical space. She is no longer to us a mere country on the map. She comes within the dear and sacred designation of our country. Other nations have undertaken to intrude themselves, Mexico, in the spirit of hostile interference against us, for the avowed object of thwarting of our policy in hampering our power, limiting our greatness, in checking the fulfillment of our manifest destiny, to overspread the continent allotted by our providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. The independence of Texas was complete and absolute. It was an independence not only in fact, but of right. No obligation of duty toward Mexico tended in the least degree to restrain our right to effect the desired recovery of the fair providence once our own. If Texas became peopled with an American population, it was by no contrivance of our government, but by the express invitation of Mexico herself. Now, unquote. There's a lot to unpack here. A lot. Number one, notice the rhetoric used here that says, it was an invitation of Mexico. Yep, that part is true. The original Americans that settled Texas were invited by Mexico. But that ignores the fact they spurned and ignored Mexican laws. That's just a fact. In addition, notice the disdain in the words that are used for both Mexico and Mexicans. I mean, he's laying the blame for Texas independence on Mexico for merely inviting people to live there, rather than expecting Americans to live by the rules of the nation in which they live. I mean, the audacity of this. But he's also very clearly articulating that Americans view themselves as superior. Now, the way I usually describe manifest destiny is that it is our God-given right, nay, our God-given duty, our humble accord to spread our superior culture from sea to shining sea. That's what manifest destiny was. This idea that because supposedly the United States has a superior culture, it is their duty given by God to spread the culture across the entire country westward, from sea to shining sea. And believe me, we will manifest our destiny all over the place. I mean, you can see in the picture, your bottom left of your screen, the angel with the Bible in one hand and technology in the other, bringing light to the darkness of the so-called heathen, savage Native Americans. So in 1844, Polk is going to win the election. But if you understand history, Polk is going to be elected in November of 1844. John Tyler is still president until James K. Polk is inaugurated, which up until the 1930s, the inauguration day was always in March. And so John Tyler has almost 5 months before James K. Polk becomes president. And so Tyler goes rogue as a lame duck president. And he resolves the question of annexation very quickly. In the last months in office, the outgoing lame duck president is going to push a joint resolution through Congress to annex Texas into the United States. Now, traditionally, you usually use a treaty, but a treaty requires a 2/3 majority. A joint resolution only requires a simple majority. And thus, by the time Polk takes office in March of 1845, Texas has now been annexed by the United States. Now, big surprise, when Mexico learns of Texas annexation, it promptly severs diplomatic ties with the United States. So when Polk takes over, he orders General Zachary Taylor to move to the Rio Grande. And this is as of October 1845. And so I have a picture on your screen, you see in the map. Now, so basically what President Polk does here, he stations General Zachary Taylor and 3,500 U.S. troops right at the Nueces River, which at the time was a disputed boundary between Texas and Mexico. Polk was not necessarily trying to go to war here. What he was trying to do was kind of ruffle his feathers. He's trying to show or portray a position of strength, of power, with the hope of this military presence that it would convince Mexico to, well, negotiate, to cower, to quit. But when Mexico did not go for it, did not, just give up, did not negotiate, Zachary Taylor then sends those troops southward into Mexico. Now, when he sends these 3,500 troops into Mexico, the result is a small skirmish. I don't even want to call it a battle because the reality is only 16 U.S. soldiers died. Again, sad for their families. It's tragic. People died. But 16 is hardly a big battle. But these 16 deaths gave Polk all the push he needed. Polk gets up before Congress and delivers a war message asking Congress to declare war on Mexico. And during this speech, he says, quote, "Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, invaded our territory, and shed American blood on American soil. War exists, notwithstanding all our effort to avoid it. It exists by an act of Mexico." Unquote. Now, he's lying here, obviously, because Mexico did not cross the border. In fact, Mexico still claimed all the territories theirs anyway. But Polk sent troops into undisputed space into the Mexican country and resulted in a skirmish. The blood was not shed on American soil, it was shed on Mexican soil. And it bitterly divided Congress, including Lincoln himself, who questioned Polk's truthfulness. And even though Congress will eventually, in a bitterly debated, they will declare war, they also made it clear, Polk did at least, that this was not just about Texas anymore. Polk wanted New Mexico, Arizona, California as well, because he wanted a railroad across the Southwest, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Now, again, I'm not going to go into great detail about the war here. I'm not a necessarily a war person. But what happens is General Zachary Taylor is going to dominate the battles in northern Mexico. At the same time, General Winfield Scott will land at Veracruz in southern Mexico. And he will march to Mexico City and actually occupy the Mexican capital. And so the war starts officially in 1846. It's over by the end of 1847. It's a very short war. So you have to picture this. By late 1847, General Zachary Taylor has kicked Mexican butt all over northern Mexico. And Winfield Scott is occupying their capital, Mexico City. So now the question now is negotiate. How much land does the United States really want? And believe me, there are some actual maps of Polk that Polk wanted below Mexico City. In other words, that Mexico City itself would now belong to the United States. And there are some actual maps you can find in the presidential records that have this discussion. They figured any lower than Mexico City, there were too many Indios, too many Indians who were involved. However, the reason that this never gained traction was for two reasons. Number one, General Winfield Scott said, guys, this is a bad idea because you don't understand. Mexico is not only fighting the United States, they're still fighting their own Indios, their own people. This guerrilla-style warfare that's destabilizing the nation. We can't win that fight. We won't. They won't welcome us as conquering heroes. They will turn and fight against us. In addition, Southern senators in Congress rejected this plan, this far southern border here below Mexico City, because if you take this border, you are inheriting 7 million Mexicans who are anti-slavery, who have rejected slavery, who have ended slavery in their territory. And prominent senators like John C. Calhoun of South Carolina said, no. We don't want 7 million people voting against slavery. So they said, okay, fine, we'll move the line up a little bit. This was still too many people, the 22nd parallel. There were still too many darn abolitionist Mexicans, about 1 million of them. Once again, people like John C. Calhoun objected to this. And so the result is we will get our approximate current boundaries, which have far fewer people to deal with. In fact, only about 100,000. So they went from 7 million south of Mexico City to 1 million at the 22nd parallel to the current border where we only have about 100,000 to deal with. Oh, fun fact, by the way. Before General Scott left Mexico City after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, he turns and gives all the weapons to the Mexican government to help the Mexican government fight against their own insurgents, the Indios. This marks the first time that the United States helps prop up a foreign government because the foreign government is amenable to the United States. In other words, in this situation, the United States just defeated them in a war. They've negotiated peace terms. They don't want some new government taking power in Mexico who might try to fight against the United States. So because we have a passive, subjective government here to deal with, they want to prop up the current Mexican government. And so Winfield Scott leaves all the guns behind so they can use those weapons to fight off their own insurgents, their own kind of mini civil war they're dealing with. Now, of course, now we have more land. In fact, about 530,000 square miles. What do you do with that? And of course, the big question with this problem, if you know from U.S. history, we have a bunch more land, but we have two big issues with this new land. The first of which, with all this new land, will this have slavery or not? This becomes a dividing issue that, if you know U.S. history, is going to be a push toward the eventual Civil War. The second big issue is, yes, there's not 7 million Mexicans voting against slavery, not even 1 million Mexicans, but there are still people living there. And so while the issue of slavery will eventually lead to the Civil War, I want to take a minute to focus on the people living there. So the United States, once again, gets 530,000 square miles. Now, according to the 1850 U.S. Census, in that new territory that was now the U.S. Southwest, there were about 150,000 Native Americans. Now, we're not going to focus on them too much because, quite honestly, from the United States perspective, they don't care about them. What was concerning, though, was there were still approximately 100,000 Mexicans. And again, the number ranges anywhere from 86 to 116,000. And there is a breakdown. Approximately New Mexico territory has right around 70,000. California has about 10,000. Texas has about 15 to 20,000 at this point. And Arizona has about 1,000. Again, these are all ranges, right? And so the question is, what do you do with these people? Because these are people with families. These are not empty, this is not empty, vacant land, but rather these are families that have lived there for generations. These are Christians. Most are Catholics, but they're Christians. And the fate of this land and its inhabitants ultimately falls to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ends the Mexican-American War. Now, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2nd, 1848. It ends the war. And the treaty was quite clear. Mexican nationals living in the Southwest who wished to become U.S. citizens, all they had to do was just stay on their land. Their land was guaranteed, supposedly. Again, more on that in future lectures. But they stay on their land. The land is theirs. The land is guaranteed. And if they wish to become U.S. citizens, do nothing, just stay there. And as of January 1st, 1849, they would become U.S. citizens with the rights and privileges thereof, including property rights. And so the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo not only grants the United States 530,000 square miles of land, it also brings in about 100,000 essentially foreigners, right? These are Mexican nationals who are going to be brought in, and they are going to be given U.S. citizenship. Now, if they don't want to remain U.S. citizens, they can feel free to leave, go down further south into what is then Mexico. But if they stay, they can become U.S. citizens, which theoretically then gives them all the rights and privileges thereof. It includes property rights. Now, we're going to stop here. When we come back next time, we're going to talk about what this actually means in practice. Because theoretically, these 100,000 Mexicans are now going to be U.S. citizens. They are equal with other U.S. whites, with Anglos. But we're going to see that's not the case. So, we're going to stop here. When we come back next time, we'll continue the second half of this lecture. But for now, take care and bye-bye.